maybe it said Bitcoin or something. Maybe that would draw people in. I'm actually talking about the SAT, the ACT, something that is relevant to many of the people in this room. And I'm going to make the, I suppose, unlikely argument that these tests in many ways reveal some cultural contradictions that go back to the 18th century that reveal something about the period of time that we call the Enlightenment and some debates that are still raging in the culture in which we all live. My own, oh, I'm supposed to click this. There we go. In my own life, I took the SAT senior year of December. I lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, so I put on a hat and gloves and I drove to the center with my best friend. We took the test, I came back, and in that time and place, in the late 80s, in many ways it worked as it should. Anyone could see, any college, that I was horrible at math, that I didn't like math. My math scores were crappy, and they could probably guess that I didn't even do my math homework, and I didn't. In fact, I was a problematic student. I wouldn't turn in assignments if I didn't like the teacher, and yet one week I went to the public library, checked out a copy, an unedited copy of The Wife of Bath, because I suspected there were things missing in our version, and the things that were missing were all the dirty parts, and so I got in a lot of trouble. I got kicked out of class. But the test also revealed that I was a reader, an obsessive reader. It was something that I hid from my friends. If you're on the soccer team in Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1987, you don't want everyone to know that you have a crush on Jane Austen. You keep it a secret or you get beat up. But I was able to show colleges that I was a reader, and a liberal arts college gave me a chance, despite my up and down record, and I ended up graduating Phi Beta Kappa, and I earned fellowships later when I graduated to UCLA and earned graduate degrees. I ended up teaching English literature for 7 years at UCLA, doing something that was tremendously rewarding. For me, the SAT was sort of life-changing, but it's not that way for everyone, and there are definitely critics of the SAT and ACT, and lately, with the new changes that will affect you guys, I find that I'm one of those critics. So I want to talk a little bit about the cultural the contradictions and the problems with some of the new SAT. One of the problems looks like this. You can argue, and many people have, that the SAT has cultural bias built into it. So here's an example of an analogy. These used to be on the SAT from 1970. Anyone want to guess what the right answer is? C. It is C. But in Fort Wayne, Indiana, for some reason, in gym, we didn't have rowing. I've come to learn that at Phillips Exeter Academy, you do engage in rowing. And so you would know, well, an oarsman, duh, competes in a regatta. But if you live in Fort Wayne, Indiana, or you grew up on the south side of Chicago, it's possible you might not know this. But to be fair, this question was removed from the SAT almost immediately. And the SAT, over the last couple of decades, has been constructed so that it's pretty sensitive to cultural differences. In fact, marginal groups tend to make up almost 20% of the passages. I would argue that if you read the SAT, you're going to see a more diverse vision of the United States than if you watch a congressional hearing on CNN. There's a voice from the late 60s, two sociologists who made this argument regarding cultural bias, and I find it persuasive. Those who look askance at testing should not rest their case on the simple notion that tests are unfair to the poor. Life is unfair to the poor. Tests merely measure the results. Another argument you can make, another critique of the SAT, is that it's coachable. For many years, College Board argued simply that it wasn't coachable. The argument was, no, the SAT measures something innate in you. It's not coachable. The argument that the SAT is coachable as a criticism has always puzzled me, because I'm pretty certain that education itself is coachable, if English and math aren't coachable, then why are we teaching it in high school? Why do we have English teachers and math teachers? If we want a test that measures the English and math skills that we're born with, aren't we imagining a world that looks a little bit like a movie like Gattaca or a book like Brave New World, where we're all fixed and we have certain at-birth traits? Something's wrong in your English class if you read Brave New World as a hopeful vision of the future. It's a dystopia. It's not the world that most of us want to live in. But I would argue that how we see the world, how we imagine the world is in fact something that's at issue, is something that's at stake in the debates that are going to be reinvigorated with a new SAT. In many ways, debates about the SAT and the ACT come down to a very long-standing debate since the 18th century about whether the world that we live in is one that is given or one that is made. Whether we live in a world that has fixed realities, that there's no getting around, or whether we could make and create a world that is more fair and more equitable. Here's a vision from the medieval period up into the early 18th century of the way the world is structured. We see it as given or fixed. We call this, of course, the great chain of being. God is at the top, and angels are above him, and then nobles are above peasants. The world is neatly structured and ordered. Even non-living things have their own hierarchies. In the great chain of being, you need to know your place. If you're lowly rock like shale, you can't aspire to be like granite. A person who expresses this nicely is the early 18th century poet Alexander Pope, in a famous and very long poem, I'm giving you only one line, called Essay on Man. He ends the first epistle by saying, "One truth is clear, whatever is right." In other words, don't get any ideas. Don't try to change things. Know your place. Of course, by the end of the 18th century, there were a lot of people who saw a different world. One of them is Mary Wollstonecraft, mother of Mary Shelley. When she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she essentially argued that if women seem to be inferior, it is because they've been raised that way. They have been made that way, and we could make them differently. She argued largely about how women would be educated, making the case that things could be different, things could be better. This is essentially the central insight of the Enlightenment, that we can make the world, make it differently, make it better. This idea inspired the American Revolution. It inspired the French Revolution. It is why we have public high schools. It is why the United States exists. What does this have to do with the SAT? The SAT was originally envisioned and created as an aptitude test. It was envisioned as a test that would find things that were fixed and innate in human beings. To be fair, it was a wildly democratic, optimistic project in the 1920s and 30s. The argument that conservatives made was, if there are talented people on a farm or in public housing, who cares? But presidents of Ivy League schools had a deep suspicion that if we institute testing that measures aptitude, something fixed, we'll find hidden talent, and they assumed that this hidden talent would reflect another kind of order that in the 1930s was a pretty common idea, I'm embarrassed to tell you, among educated people, an idea that we call eugenics. In fact, most of the Ivy League presidents believed there was a great chain of being, a hierarchy that looked like this. There were Nordic peoples They considered themselves to be in that group. And alpine cultures and ethnicities and Mediterranean people. Notice that all of these groups are effectively what we call white. And that the SAT would, of course, naturally reflect this kind of hierarchy. Today, of course, it's an ugly word, but today we just call eugenics racism. It's not as exciting an idea. And college presidents were frustrated and puzzled because the SAT revealed a very different world than the one they imagined existed. What it revealed by the 1950s was that Eastern European immigrants had better scores than almost any other group. They were Jewish. They were immigrants. There wasn't a spot in this hierarchy for them. The test was understood to probably be coachable. It was something that if you worked hard, you could do well on, which is really what the ACT is about. In 1959, in the University of Iowa, they introduced a test called the ACT, and it was meant to be an achievement test. It was meant to be a test of what you learned. This is a very different kind of test, and it's a very different vision of the world. I would want you to consider an aptitude test assumes that things are fixed, that things are given, and it will discover those fixed hierarchies. An achievement test assumes something like growth, and that we can make something of ourselves and of our world. Our cultural moment today is heavily invested in achievement, and that's probably a good thing. I'm an achievement person. I wouldn't have spent so many years in the classroom if I didn't think that you could get better, that you could grow by working. This guy is definitely an achievement kid. Has anybody seen this? It was huge last week in China. This is called Ice Boy. He apparently walks 2 miles each way to school. Last week he walked in the freezing weather, so he arrived with his hair frozen. I would argue that this shows some of the problems with the achievement model too. Sometimes we can work so hard it's not good for us, but as it was told in Chinese media, he showed up at the classroom and he got a 99 out of 100 on his test. Another way of thinking about achievement is through the work of Dr. Carol Dweck, who talks about mindset, a fixed versus a growth mindset. Carol Dweck argues that smart isn't something that you are, that could be fixed and discovered. Smart is something that you become, and it's something that all of us could become with a little work, with a little effort. There are a few problems, to be sure, with the achievement mindset, and here's one of them. I don't know if you can see all of this. This is the freshman admission profile for Berkeley. Sometimes even I wonder, why don't we get rid of tests and have a pure achievement model, just grades? I mean, that's achievement. One of the problems is there were 43,142 students who applied to Berkeley above a 4.0. There's not room for everyone who worked hard and achieved. And to get above a 4.0, I'm pretty sure you have to take a heavy complement of AP classes. What if your school doesn't have any AP classes? At Mount Carmel, you might think, well, that's crazy. No, that's actually common. That's the norm across California. The norm is 981 students to a counselor. Achievement has to acknowledge our accomplishments are going to be tied to the resources and environment in which we live. Besides, if we just said, okay, Berkeley, Harvard, Yale, they'll only accept valedictorians. There are 36,000 high schools in the United States. There are 36,000 valedictorians. And is a valedictorian better in any way than the number 4? or number 14 or 24 person? Maybe they just scratched their way to that spot. There are other issues with achievement. One of them is the University of Iowa in 1959, creating the ACT, was creating it for the University of Iowa. They wanted to know simply, are you prepared? Do you have the basic skills? In other words, an achievement test should really be more of a pass-fail endeavor. It's like the test you take to get your license. At the DMV, you either have the skills or you don't. You don't, as far as I know, no one is the valedictorian of the DMV. You don't get pulled over for speeding and the cop is like, wow, you're 5 with Ken. The achievement model has a number of problems, but it's in many ways, of course, better than an aptitude model. But the real problem is selective colleges like Berkeley and like Yale and Harvard, they need to know more than just, are you prepared for college to make their admission system work. They need to know, how do you compare with other people? And so they need something like this. They want a normal distribution curve. They want a bell curve that will tell them how you compare with everyone else. But an achievement test isn't meant to do that. It's not supposed to do that. An achievement test should tell us who tried, who achieved, and that could be everyone. But if colleges need a bell curve, and they need the ACT and SAT to deliver that, there's got to be some way of manipulating a test conceived as an achievement test and turning it into something else that produces this bell curve. What you do is what they do at carnivals, when you need to make sure that most people don't win the game. You add something tricky, something difficult that's not easily discerned. And on the new SAT, and for a long time on the ACT, what they introduce is time. They are timed tests. The ACT is not inherently a difficult test, but you're generally not given enough time to complete it, because what we call processing speed, how we're wired neurologically, is something that will plot out on a bell curve. Here, we'll take a look at the bell curve again. Some kids are fast. In another century, we even used this as a synonym for smart. We said people were quick. But this is something that is wired in. This is something you are born with. So what we're seeing is, very quietly, even I would say secretly, we now have two tests that look like they're achievement tests, but they are not. They are aptitude tests, measuring something that is innate, something that you were born with. And I would argue something irrelevant to learning and knowledge. I want to know if you understood what you read. I would prefer, if you were a student of mine at UCLA, that you read something 2 or 3 times. I don't care how fast you read it. I've had parents, I've had clients tell me, can't you teach my kid to speed read? Aren't there speed reading techniques? The answer is no, there aren't. What people assume is speed reading, there's another more proper name for it. It's called skimming. Do we want to educate kids, reward them for skimming? If you hire a lawyer, is it very useful that he says, look, I graduated from Harvard, I had a great SAT, so I read documents really fast. I can give you the gist of this. Someone is very angry at you. That's not super useful as a skill. Full disclosure, when you start companies that deal with education and help people apply to college, it's good for business when there are changes to the SAT and the ACT. It makes people worried. It makes them anxious. But I'm worried, and I think you should be worried, because not only are you at a disadvantage if you're not fast, if you're not a fast processing speed kid, colleges don't seem to understand that these shifts and changes to the SAT and that are inherent in the ACT are really going on. I go to conferences all the time. 2 years ago, I attended a conference. I was in a room bigger than this one, 500 college admissions officers attending. And when it was my chance to go to the microphone, I asked them, has anyone here taken the new SAT? Have any of you even looked at it? Not a single hand among that group of professionals was raised. In many ways, you know, these are just tests. They're unpleasant things that have to be gotten through a phase of your life. But in another way, a more meaningful way, I want to argue the debates that we have as a culture about how we select kids for college and about these tests, they really do go back to an older, let's go forward one more, to an older argument about whether we live in a world that is given or a world that is made, one that we make. If we really do believe that there are fixed categories and people should know their place, then okay, we should have a test that seeks out the 1% of geniuses that may be out there. We should have a test, I guess, that measures how fast you read. But if we believe that the world, as the Founding Fathers did, the world is one that we make, one that we create, one that we could make more fair, that we could make ourselves better, then I think we want to stick to this model of achievement. It's a better way of looking at students and thinking about them. But we also need to be honest about the fact that if we believe in that model, we need to fund public schools more generously. We need to fund them more fairly, because not everyone has the same chance to achieve and succeed. And the tests will merely tell us something we should already suspect, that the world we're building isn't as fair as the one that we wanted. I'm not convinced that we probably should be, as an earlier generation 70 years ago was convinced, building a test that measures the 1% and finds the geniuses. I'm more inclined to think we want to build a system that nurtures and encourages the genius that may be present in all of us, in all of you. Thank you very much.